Hello everyone, it's Tejinder Sidhu, and we welcome you all in another interview session with one of the really renowned scholar, Dr. Raghvinder Jha. Dr. Raghvinder Jha, we warmly welcome you in this session.
Thank you very much.
So friends, as you know, in the last session, we talked about one of his popular book, Facets of India's Economy and Her Society, Volume 1. In the last interview session and discussion, we talk about various aspects of that book. And in today's session, we are going to talk about the Volume 2 of the same title that we talked in the last session, Facets of India's Economy and Her Society, Volume 2, and its subtitle is Current State and Future Prospects. So everyone, here's a book that you can see that Dr. Raghvinder Jha has worked really hard on, and we're going to talk various aspects about this book today. So Dr. Jha, first of all, I would like to ask you, how many chapters does this volume consist of? And broadly speaking, what are their contents?
Thank you very much, Tejinder. Yes, this volume consists of 10 chapters, and it's basically comments on the existing state of India's economy and her society. The first chapter concerns itself with Indian agriculture. The second chapter talks about India's manufacturing sector. And the third chapter talks about India's services sector, how that has developed. The fourth chapter of the volume examines India's engagement with the world economy in terms of trade, in terms of investment, in terms of migration from India, and in terms of remittances from the rest of the world to India. So in chapter 5, I concern myself with fiscal federalism in India. As you know, India is a federal country. States and the center have different areas of governance associated with them. So I talk about that. And I also talk about the newly instituted goods and services tax in the Indian economy. And also transfers, vertical transfers from the central government to the state governments, and then further down to the panchayats and local bodies as designed by the various finance commission. In chapter 6, I examine the two critical sectors of health and education in India, how they have developed over time, and what are the issues relating to health and education in India. So in chapter 7, I look at the state of India's environment, and chapter 8, I look at the issues, special issues related to women in India, women's issues, gender issues in India. Chapter 9 talks about the state of inter-community relations in India. As you know, India is a very heterogeneous society with various groups of various ethnicities living together for thousands of years. So how their problems have evolved over time and how they coexist and in peace, that will be examined in that chapter. And finally, I examine prospects for India's future and what are the policy measures to ensure that India continues to grow and prosper in the times to come.
All right, that's great, Doctor. So I think as per our previous discussion, you're trying to just cover quite really a large picture of different aspects. All right. So next thing I would like to ask you, please explain the principal conclusions from chapter 1.
Yes, chapter 1 is a very critical chapter for India, for the book and for India as well, because it looks at the state of Indian agriculture. Agriculture is central to India. It still is home. Agricultural occupations still occupy more than 55% of India's population, but although its share in GDP is quite small, it has been falling over the years. So that's one of the fundamental problems in India actually, that the agricultural sector is home to, provides livelihood to such a large proportion of the population, and yet generates such a small proportion of GDP. So which means that the productivity of agriculture, particularly land in agriculture, is not very high, and that is a major challenge facing the Indian economy. So the chapter recounts the drastic neglect of agriculture that happened during the British times. We talked about that in volume 1. And then it goes on to look at the policies of Jawaharlal Nehru, the first Prime Minister of India, towards agriculture. Now, Nehru was influenced considerably by the Soviet model of development. He had visited the Soviet Union prior to independence, and he was very impressed by the rapid industrialization of the Soviet Union, quote unquote. So he basically tried to implement the same model for India. He started off with a program of massive industrialization based on the public sector, not the private sector, and instituted a regime of controls on investment and controls on various other things, prices, licenses, imports, and that meant that the agriculture actually was neglected quite considerably. And even though industrialization did take place, it happened only because of foreign aid, largely because of foreign aid, and agriculture suffered a lot. So for the first few decades of India's independence, India had a huge food problem. And India had to import vast quantities of food under Public Law 480, PL 480 from the United States, particularly wheat it had to import. And basically India was under political pressure from the United States during that period, because it was relying on American wheat for feeding its people. So that happened during Nehru's time, and partly during the time of the next Prime Minister, Lal Bahadur Shastri, and extended a bit to the Prime Ministership of Nehru's daughter, Indira Gandhi. So towards the end of the Shastri regime, and starting around the middle of and resuming around the middle of Indira Gandhi's regime, the Green Revolution technology came to India, and I discussed the various phases of the Green Revolution that happened in India, and the massive growth of grain, particularly wheat, in west and northwest parts of India, and India's ability to finally feed itself and not need supplies from the United States. The chapter then discusses various phases of the Green Revolution, and then its ultimate tapering off. The incremental yield from the Green Revolution has now become pretty stagnant. And another important point that the chapter discusses is that the Green Revolution did not extend to rice as much as it did to wheat. And as a consequence of that, the eastern part of the country, which is basically rice growing, Bihar, Bengal, Odisha, and so on, they did not have access to the same kind of technology for improving their yield. So that actually is the genesis, or one part of the genesis, of the inequality between East and Western India, because the technological differences that arose at the time of the Green Revolution. So that happened, and then I discussed the two major problems of Indian agriculture. The first is that the yield of land is still quite low, and the second is that the farm sizes are very small. Huge numbers of people have farm sizes of less than 2 hectares or even less than 1 hectare, and there are 144 million landless workers in India. So the book discusses how to address these two issues. Basically, it requires a lot of land consolidation, the spread of the Green Revolution to rice in the eastern part of the country, and various other measures. And finally, the book discusses various recent innovations in agriculture. Agriculture is not as gloomy as it would appear from the previous explanations. A lot of interesting things are happening in agriculture, particularly in agribusiness, and it has been taken note of by various international agencies as well. So the improvements in agribusiness, particularly in growing in horticulture and in various other things, food storage and so on, these things are also discussed, and it's basically concluded that Indian agriculture has a good future, but it needs some policy support.
Very good. So quite a few things that you discussed. So now, could we now talk about the principal conclusions of Chapter 2 of this volume, please?
Yeah. Chapter 2 is actually it deals with the manufacturing sector of India. So it is a very strange story, manufacturing, as we recalled, as you would recall from the discussion last period. Prior to the emergence of British colonialism in India, India was produced about 25%, nearly 25% of world manufacturing output. It was an amazing manufacturing country, and this is perhaps before the beginning of the Industrial Revolution in Britain and Europe. But India's manufacturing sector was basically completely leveled by colonial rules. India faced huge deindustrialization, and at the time of independence, it had only about 3% of world manufacturing output. Before the advent of British colonialism, the rest of the world had nothing to sell to India, and India used to sell textiles, but they used to give gold because they didn't have anything worthwhile to sell to India. That was the great peak that Indian manufacturing had reached. So India established, as I mentioned in the previous chapter, Naidu and others started a program of rapid industrialization, but clearly it hasn't worked because, as you can see, even now we are talking about a Make in India campaign. So why have we talked about why are we talking about a Make in India campaign? Because our manufacturing sector has not grown very fast. It has grown, but much better than what it was at the time of independence, but it is not grown very fast. And there are various and the primary reason for that is that the government instituted this public sector-led industrialization program, which was completely inconsistent with India's macroeconomic fundamentals. It led to massive balance of payments problems, and India's currency was devalued several times. It had to go to the IMF for loans. So for a country that was trying to industrialize on the basis of self-sufficiency, it was relying a lot on foreign aid and foreign institutional help. So it was not much of self-sufficiency either. So then the book looks at the improvements in India's industrial policy, manufacturing policy, particularly in the late 1980s and the reforms of 1991 to 1993, when the subsidies for exports were given up and the license quota regime was dismantled, and the rupee was made convertible on the current account, so that exports became more competitive. So India's manufacturing sector has gone through a renaissance of sorts, and it is now doing much better than it was before. Yet it has not reached its potential. So India's manufacturing, the share of manufacturing in India's GDP is not yet reached 25%. It hovers around 20-21%, whereas China's the share of Chinese manufacturing in their GDP is around 40%. So they have been much more successful in bolstering their manufacturing sector. So it looks at various challenges facing the manufacturing sector. A couple of things I would like to mention. One is that There is a very very strange kind of concentration of firms in India. You have a few very large firms and a very tiny share of GDP, share of manufacturing GDP, accounted for by a very large, small scale manufacturing sector. So you have a few large firms producing a lot of output, large number of very small firms producing very small share of the output, and a huge hole in the middle. So this is called the phenomenon of missing middle in Indian manufacturing. And there are various reasons why the middle has not grown, and whereas in most developing countries, particularly in Southeast Asia, the middle sector of manufacturing is the most dynamic part of the manufacturing sector. So that has not grown in India very much, and the reasons why that has not happened are discussed at length in the book, and what policies should be instituted to ensure that manufacturing grows faster and consists of and grows in terms of share of GDP and grows in terms of share of employment. Because manufacturing employment in India is also low. It discusses the fact that a large part of manufacturing is in the informal sector, and in the informal sector, as you know, it doesn't get counted in GDP for various reasons. So there are the reasons why that has happened, and how to make sure that the sector moves from the informal to the formal sector. And the institution of the policies of demonetization and the goods and services tax would do a lot to move some of these firms, informal sector firms, into the formal sector. Then the book talks about a very important issue, is that even though India's share of manufacturing in GDP has grown, the share of manufacturing in value added has not grown very fast. So that is because the most of the growth in the GDP, in manufacturing sector GDP, is accounted for by the growth of intermediate inputs, mainly coming from China. Okay, so the intermediate goods used in the production of manufactured goods are largely coming from China, so that the amount of value added that India makes is small, because value added is picked up by the Chinese firms. So that is a very crucial issue, and I discussed that phenomenon in detail as to how India can make sure that it has a lower reliance on China for intermediate goods into the manufacturing sector. It discusses the growth in very high value, very high tech manufacturing in India. As you know, India is now a major exporter of cars even, and various other things. It makes satellites, it makes very esoteric equipment, and how Indian policy can meet its various challenges are discussed in this volume.
All right, that's great, Doctor. So now can you please enlighten us on the discussion in Chapter 3? So just the main areas in Chapter 3, what discussions you would like to just enlighten us about?
Okay, so in Chapter 3, I discuss the services sector in India. And the services sector in India is the most significant part of the Indian economy. It contributes about 2/3 of India's GDP, though not that much in terms of employment. The chapter discusses the growth of various components of the services sector. And it talks a fair bit about the fringe elements in the services sector, like construction and so on, which are growing, but they don't offer too much formal employment. It looks at the growth in some phenomenal areas of the Indian economy, like ICT, information and communications technology, and various other things. And it argues that that part of the reason for the phenomenal growth in India's ICT sector, India is one of the leading countries in the world in the ICT sector. One of the primary reasons is that the government never saw that this sector was emerging, so it did not regulate it. So this sector went without regulation for a long time. So if you remember, when cable TV first came to India, the government didn't even notice that it existed, and suddenly it had grown so big that they had to notice it and started to regulate it. So many sectors in the services sector actually grew like that. The government did not encroach upon them, so that was actually turned out to be a good thing. Otherwise, the services sector may have had to go to the same way as the manufacturing sector, which was heavily regulated. So that is one thing. The other thing that has happened is that there is some many of the activities in manufacturing sector firms, for example, account keeping, sales, and so on and so forth, used to be done in-house earlier, and then they actually started to outsource them. So that also accounts for the phenomenal growth of the services sector in India. Okay, because these accounts and sales and various other managerial activities and so many other things which used to occur in the manufacturing sector within the firms have been outsourced. So that also accounts for the more rapid growth of the services sector as opposed to the manufacturing sector, to some extent anyway. The manufacturing sector the services sector, has attracted a huge amount of foreign direct investment from the rest of the world, and it continues to do so. And India is, as you know, in the last few years, was in some areas the highest recipient of foreign direct investment in the world economy. And the areas to which this foreign direct investment is directed are discussed at length in the book, and the benefits of foreign direct investment, apart from the money, are discussed, particularly the importation of new technology, which foreign firms have, which Indian firms may not have access to. So these things are discussed at length. The phenomenal growth and the continuing potential of sectors like tourism in India, which are very important and which are growing very fast. These tourism and other key niche areas of the services sector are discussed at length, and the immense potential that India has in providing good employment and a fair share of GDP from these sectors are also discussed at length in this chapter. And then it is the chapter stresses that India should not sit on its laurels, because a number of smaller countries are challenging India in various areas. For example, Sri Lanka and the Philippines and some countries in Southeast Asia, which have a very cheap labor force, just as India does, are also challenging India in these areas. And one of the key messages is that China has developed fast enough and grown large enough and rich enough that its wages are now very high compared to India. So if India can play its cards right, it can fill the spot that China used to fill until about 5-6 years ago, because of its lower wages. So if India plays its cards right in terms of deregulating its labor market and making making hiring and firing of workers more easy, making labor markets more flexible, then India stands at the cusp of a manufacturing and services sector revolution. So India should take advantage of that. This is one of the principal conclusions of this chapter.
All right, great. So there were some key points in chapter 3, Dr. Jha. Now I would like to ask you, can you now please tell us about India's involvement with the international economy? The subject matter of chapter 4, if you can sum up that, please, what you talk about in chapter 4.
Okay. All right, yeah, thank you very much. Now, chapter 4 is very, very important because it talks about India's engagement with the world economy. Now, we must remember that the tradition of India has been one of great engagement with the world economy. Okay, so long time, you know, even before even before 0 AD, Indians used to trade with the rest of the world. So there is mention of trade with the Roman Empire. There's mention of trade emanating from Gujarat to various parts of the world. The areas in the southeast part of the country, Tamil Nadu, Karnataka, and modern day Tamil Nadu, Karnataka, and Andhra, and so on, used to trade quite a lot with the countries of Southeast Asia. And in fact, that's how Indian goods and Indian culture and so on spread to various parts of the world. Now, and we noted that during the pre-colonial period, India's share of world manufacturing was very high. India was trading with the rest of the world quite seriously. One of the major trading nations in the world. But what happened was that during the colonial regime, the pattern of trade changed, and as you know, India started importing manufactured goods and started exporting raw material, particularly cotton. So the international trade, unfortunately, became associated with a kind of imperialism, because they thought that international trade means impoverishment, because international trade was occurring in India and India was getting very poor. So they thought that at the time of independence, the leaders thought that international trade is not good. The second thing that happened, which I mentioned earlier as well, is that the leadership at that time, particularly the Prime Minister Nehru, was enamored of the progress in the so-called progress in the Soviet Union, though as you know, we all know what happened in the Soviet Union later. And he said that it is best to assume that the economy is closed and work with our own resources, become more self-sufficient and so on. So share of India in world trade declined immensely. And India basically, some scholars have noted that India basically became detached from the world economy for almost 40 years. India's share of world trade shrank, and even tiny countries had a larger share of world trade than India at that time. So there was some effort at restoring the balance through the devaluation in 1966. Devaluation of the rupee in 1966, but that didn't go very far. That was not done to stimulate trade. That was done to restore macroeconomic balance to the economy. Then in the mid 80s, India had massive international foreign exchange problems, and finally India addressed its shortcomings with respect to international trade in the reforms that started in 1991 and went on for a while. And trade has been, and India has done very well after that in dismantling the quotas and lowering tariffs. So Indian tariffs are now quite comparable with most of Southeast Asia.